It's January the 26th, 2020, and I want to address this ongoing crisis between Russia, Ukraine, and I guess NATO, and to kind of give my perspective on the subject. I've kind of addressed it before a little bit here, and of course I keep hearing talk of the potential of a war and things of this sort, and so I thought it was a kind of an appropriate topic to get into today. Um, okay, first off, I think that we don't know exactly what the Russians' demands are totally, and obviously we cannot reasonably, agree to whatever Russia decides to demand. That's the first thing I want to lay out. Now, some people, I mean, you see commentators like Tucker Carlson take the position that, like, well, this is just nothing we should even be involved in because of the situation on the U.S. border and things like that. Well, as a quick aside, the situation at the U.S. border isn't a natural situation. This is something that was generated by the current administration. I'm not getting that in detail today, but it's not something that we're just failing to deal with. It's deliberately caused by our own side. Okay, so let's be honest about that. We do have a commitment to NATO, and NATO is a stabilizing force in the world in general. Okay. However, my position has been that after the fall of the Soviet Union and its breakup into 15 separate republics, okay, with one of them, the biggest one being Russia, and then there are others such as Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states and so on and so forth. And what's happened is that gradually NATO has moved into those areas and one by one has moved countries into NATO. And right now you have up through Poland and then Romania, Bulgaria are all part of NATO, and then the Baltic states, Lithuania, and Estonia, and so forth. Those are in there. Latvia is the other one, I think, and those have been brought to NATO, and that's where became critical, because while I believe that NATO as a country could defend frontline countries like Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, I don't think we could really stop the Russians from taking the Baltic states if they really wanted to. Now, there are things that we might do in retaliation for that, because Russia has this enclave that's really located in northern Poland by the Baltic Sea, and it's a big military base, and that could be attacked in retaliation. So there may be a mutual hostage relationship here, if you will. But I tend to think that as far as Ukraine and Georgia, these are so deep into Russian sphere of influence, and so there's no way we can realistically defend them without having a massive military deployment in those countries, which we're obviously unwilling to do and always were, and even attempting to set one up might set the war off right there. So that's why I think that we need to take a different tact on this subject. By the way, if you like these videos, please give me a like for that helps out with the algorithm. Subscribe. If you subscribe, you can click the bell for notifications also, and forward links to anybody that might be interested. Okay, so let's get on with this. My thinking is that essentially what would be a good outcome here would be that Ukraine and Georgia should be neutral countries, not in NATO, and not occupied by Russia, but be buffer countries between the two. I don't think we really want a situation like we had in the Cold War, where in the East and West Germany, where we literally had large armies from both sides literally facing off against each other, all 24/7 all the time, backed up by Air Force and nuclear weapons. I mean, that's not the kind of situation we really would like to have. Now, I'd point out during the Cold War, even in the worst of it, we had some neutral countries that were sort of buffers. Austria and Finland, and for that matter, Sweden also. Remember, Norway was a NATO member, and so there was Russia on one side of Finland and Norway on the other side of Sweden, and there was neutral countries in between that were buffer zones. And those were far more stable areas during the Cold War. And that's what I think would be a good outcome here. So, because, if Russia were to actually occupy Ukraine, in addition to be facing all the things that they'd face that's been discussed in the media, they would then create a situation where we would definitely have to deploy more forces into the frontline countries, or else the whole NATO thing would collapse like a house of cards. And so I think that what would be useful here is to negotiate sincerely. One of the Russian demands I actually completely agree with, and that is that Ukraine should not be part of NATO. There's no reason why it should be part of NATO. And in fact, if under the current circumstance, if they were to become part of NATO, um, since Russia already occupies Crimea, which is part of Ukraine according to their own belief and the generally recognized international borders of most countries is being recognized, that would immediately be we would almost just be declaring war on Russia right there, because Ukraine could then say, well, we've been attacked and you have to come to our defense. You see, so that's one reason why they can't become part of NATO at the present time anyhow, as I see it. And I don't think it's a good idea even for them to seek such a thing. It might be good for domestic politics in Ukraine, but realism, no. On the other hand, we definitely don't want them to be occupied by Russia. Now, I keep hearing these discussions that, like, we have these incredible economic sanctions that we can put on Russia, and we can just control them with economic sanctions. Well, I think we can definitely hurt Russia with economic sanctions, but at the same time, do we really want to get into that situation? I mean, the real question that comes up to me is, since already, Germany is getting a large amount of their natural gas from Russia, and Russian oil is a big part of the world oil market, and that is very interactive. If we cut them off from being able to trade in dollar-denominated currencies, wouldn't that undermine the petrodollar, which is one of the bedrocks of our financial system? I mean, do we really want to do things like this? We got to stop thinking about anger about this and think realistically. The other risk we run into, short of actual shooting war, which again, that's being overemphasized because really we don't really have the capabilities in place to really engage in this war, in my opinion. I guess we could theoretically engage in air war. That is, we could bring in air support for the Ukrainian army as they battle the Russian advance if it were to occur. But there's a real danger that Russia would have to respond by attacking the bases in NATO countries from which those air sorties are being launched. And all of a sudden, we're in a situation where we're actually at war with Russia, an actual shooting war. Okay, so I think that's not a good approach either. And the other threat we face is, in the event of massive economic sanctions, is cyber warfare. What if Russia escalates to full-scale cyber warfare against the West, particularly the U.S.? Now, I think the U.S. is far more dependent on the internet economy than I think Russia is. I mean, look what happened with that Colonial Pipeline with a crypto locker situation, as an example. What if this were to happen on a massive scale? I'm sure we would retaliate, and we have some excellent hackers, and we have our own cyber warfare people in the Pentagon and the NSA and so forth, and I'm sure we can do damage too. But it looks to me like the balance of vulnerability favors the Russians on that situation. And definitely they can make the American home front feel some pain. I mean, like if the power grid goes down in the middle of the winter, that wouldn't be too nice at all. And that actually will take lives because, it'll affect people in hospitals and medical care, and people will get sick and freeze. And, this is an ugly situation that could occur. And that's why I think we shouldn't be cavalier about what we're going to do to Russia and all this stuff. And Russia should be very careful what they do also. In a worst case scenario, this could escalate into a war, and well, we are dealing with two nuclear armed powers. I don't think I need to say more about that issue at the moment. So I think what we really need to do is negotiate in good faith. And one of the Russian demands I think we can agree to is that Ukraine not become part of NATO. The same for Georgia. I don't think anybody's really pushing to do that anyhow. The second thing I think, though, is that we obviously don't want Russia to invade Ukraine. Now, there is an issue that there are areas in Ukraine, as I speak, that are in actual rebellion against the Ukrainian government. And they are supported by the Russians, and they involve Russian ethnic people that are inside the Ukraine. And some sort of a political solution needs to be worked out about those areas. Now, exactly what that needs to be is another question, and that's going to be a hard part. But that's the thing we need to deal with. On the other hand, it looks to be like there's all sorts of economic sanctions already in place against Russia, and it looks to be like that one thing that we could offer also would be to ease some of those. On the other hand, Russia could actually curtail this cyber crime that's been coming out of Russia for years also. I mean, they recently just arrested 3 major hackers in a known hacker group that was involved in a lot of credit card fraud. I think it's called Infraud or something like that. There's a group, and this could be a sign from Russia, that they're willing to be reasonable potentially. And like I said, the other thing is I think Russia has something to gain too by having better relations with the United States and the Western world, which has been really messed up, and a lot of it was messed up because of the Democrat Party's anti-Trump policies, trying to link Trump to Russia, and then effectively using any pretext to say, well, Trump, if you don't go along with these sanctions against Russia, then you're obviously in league with them, and therefore to defend yourself politically, you have to go along with this. So while Trump originally wanted to improve relationships with Russia, as General Flynn had suggested, what happened was our relations soured greatly during that period, not because of Trump's designs, but because of the designs of all the Trump enemies. And so it looks to me like there are things that Russia could gain from this too. One, they would get what they want about NATO. On the other hand, presumably there would not be an invasion of Ukraine or an actual annexation, but there might be certain regional autonomy given to some areas inside of Ukraine, or some sort of arrangement, short of a Russian occupation, that would provide protection for that. And the other thing I think would be to accept that Crimea does go back to Russia, and that border be recognized by Ukraine in return for not being invaded any further. Remember, the Crimea was part of Russia until sometime in the early 60s, when as an administrative matter within the Soviet Union, it was moved into the administrative control of the Russian Republic into the Ukrainian Republic from the Russian Republic within the Soviet structure. So it's not like this is really inherently, Ukrainian territory anyhow. And I think the people there really would prefer to be part of Russia. I think, I'm not sure, but they did it. At any rate, I think it's a fait accompli short of an actual shooting war. So I think that would be a reasonable accommodation that could be made without changing much. But on the other hand, like I say, ending of this cyber activity that Russia's been engaged in, or greatly curtailing it, working with law enforcement to cut down the criminal element, would be a very good thing for us. And furthermore, the key thing we should want out of it, what our big gain would be, to try to divide Russia from China, and try to prevent a Russia-Chinese alliance, which would be a really bad situation because, in a sense, the two countries are complementary. China's economically strong, Russia's economically weak. Russia's very rich in resources, but China maybe not as much. And also, finally, the thing to consider is Russia has a very active strategic nuclear capacity right now. China is simply beginning to develop theirs. So if you put the two together, and you have kind of a colossus on your hands, I think. And that's why we'd like to split those two up if we can diplomatically, and improving our relationship with Russia is a way to do this. This is purely geostrategic. This is not caving to Russia. This is working out for our own interest. And I guess here's an area where I tend to agree with what Tucker Carlson's saying. In fact, I was actually saying it, I think, before he did. But the point is, it's an obvious fact of life. And so I think this is the problem. It seems to me we're doing some diplomacy, but we need to move in these directions. Now, one last thing. I go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think hopefully they'll take a page from that. Because of the degree to which each side has kind of been beating its chest and drawing lines in the sand and so forth, the solution may be that there isn't a formal solution, but there's an informal one. For instance, we really did trade missiles in Turkey for missiles in Cuba, but officially we never admitted that. Officially we just made the assurance we will. Pull the missiles out of Turkey after you get yours pulled out of Cuba. And also, there's another aspect that's relevant also. The balance of power at the time in the region, even short of the strategic nuclear capability in which the U.S. was dominant at the time, The conventional capabilities that the U.S. posed against Cuba were a decisive factor. However, if they'd been used, they could have escalated into a nuclear war, as been determined in some of the meetings that have occurred over recent years, since that they saw what the real disposition of forces were and the lack of command and control authority that really existed in Cuba, where the actual generals in Cuba actually had the physical ability to launch the weapons on their own volition if they were attacked. So, although whether they would have done it or not, I don't know. We did come close in one instance involving a submarine that was being pinged pretty heavily by our destroyers, though. So, my point is that this could be worked out, and maybe the real accommodations might be kind of more like secret agreements that are not stated formally. I think in order for both sides to save face, but we really should move in this direction, I think. And there's a lot to be gained by it. I think an actual escalating conflict with Russia could lead to some pretty nasty cyber attacks on the U.S. and economic sanctions on Russia, which would be kind of bad for both. Well, at any rate, that's kind of my position on that. I just kind of clear where I am on the subject. I don't really see deploying a limited number of troops to frontline NATO countries like Romania or Poland as a negative thing at all, because I think at the same time we do have to, assure our allies that the NATO is a viable alliance, but we shouldn't extend it in areas where it really shouldn't go. Well, I'll close this for now. By the way, the links to my social media accounts are below, not the links, but the handles. I don't really put the links because when you click a link to a social media account, you usually get a mess anyhow. But you can get on there and follow me on that. And I generally post a lot on Twitter, but I've been increasingly posting on Gab, Gettr, and Parler as well. Okay, I'll wrap this up for now. Until next time.